Some of the high lakeland valleys and tops, they hold birds that you can't find anywhere else. For example, ring ouzel, golden plover, whinchats, and one that I struck up a particular interest with was the Dotterel, which you find on the high plateaus of the Lakeland Fells and the Cumbrian Pennines. I'd heard whispers of Dotterel, this magical bird that hardly anyone had ever seen. And then in the early 1970s I saw the monograph The Dotterel by Desmond Ellersall Thompson. Now, there was reference historically to Dotterel breeding in Cumberland and Westmoreland as it was then. And it listed a few places in the Western and the Central Lakes. But unfortunately for me, it was the end of the summer when I got this book. And Dotterels are summer migrants. They migrate to North Africa for the winter. Nevertheless, I was determined, and during that winter, I scoured Ordnance Survey maps looking for suitable habitat for Dotterel on the mountain tops. They seldom nest less than 2,500 feet, so there's a limit there of the availability of nesting habitat for them. The flatter type, the Helvellyn Range, the Buttermere and Ennerdale Fells, some of those are suitable for Dotterel. Between about the 1920s, where there were possibly 3 or 4 pairs nesting, until the late 1960s, there were only about 10 incidences of breeding in 50 years. And during that time, there's always been an interest in Dotterel, mostly from the Acquisitive Society, because in the previous couple of centuries, there's been people who were keen to collect rare birds' eggs. And even Dotterel were shot and their flight feathers used as flies, tying flies for salmon and trout fishing. What used to be said, what's shot is history and what's missed is mystery. So there's no cameras, no binoculars in those days, so really evidence of proof was the body of the bird or the eggs of the species. The very first time I went looking for Dotterel, I found them. It was the first week in May in 1974, and it was on the Buttermere Fells, which is one of the fells that had been named in the book where they'd nested in the late 1800s. And I'd been up on the fell for a couple of hours, and then I saw something running in front of me, because that's what Dotterel do. They're very reluctant to fly, although they are strong flyers. They use their cryptic plumage to hide themselves against the background of the ground. So I saw one running, and then I raised my binoculars, and then there were 3. And then, as I walked towards them, they got up and flew, and there were 5 in fact, because they were feeding, and they were running and feeding. And I sat watching them for about another hour, mesmerised. And then I left the top and went home a happy man. Well, from the early 70s until 1988, I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours going looking for them. And every year I found nests. In fact, I was very, very lucky, because the time I went looking for them seemed to coincide with the time when they became more plentiful. More plentiful meant that they nested annually, rather than once every 10 years or once every 5 years. Sometimes you don't find the nest, and what you come across is the chicks with the parents, after they've hatched. And once they hatch, within a few hours they become mobile. And because they're not fed by the parents, they have to secure their own food, although of course they are guarded by the parent. Unlike any other bird in Britain, apart from another one called the red-necked phalarope, Dotterel are one-parent family. And unusually, it's the male that incubates the eggs and looks after the chicks. It's believed because they are a high montane species, another parent, which would need to feed itself, would be competition for its own chicks. In the latter part of the 20th century, there was a cooling of the climate in the 1960s and 1970s. Dotterel are high montane species, which theoretically means they're almost an Arctic species. But what happens in Britain, they go to higher altitudes, which is an Arctic substitute. And the coincidence of them breeding in greater numbers in Cumbria in the 1970s also correlated with what was happening in Scotland. The numbers in Scotland increased dramatically. And since then, at the very end of the last century, everyone's familiar with global warming and the warming of the climate. And it looks very likely that as Dotterel don't seem to be breeding in any regularity these days, that the climate is the bigger factor. Dotterel lay their eggs on the ground, and they rely on the cryptic camouflage of the parents, the chicks and the eggs to secure their future. They can put up with quite a lot of indirect disturbance. What may be affecting them is when the birds arrive in spring, which is early May, and they're settling down to court and to breed, establish a territory. If the disturbance is heavy then, I think that they may move on, and I think that may well be a factor. Certainly anyone who goes on the high tops now will notice the change in the number of people there than there used to be in the 70s. One particular time in early May, around about 1981, we were on Cross Fell, and the mist was about 3,000 feet level. And what we were finding, there were Dotterel everywhere. Some of them were on the ground running in parties, some of them were pitching down out of the mist, and then some of them were taking off. And we estimate that we saw about 150 in about an hour. Now these would almost certainly have been migrants going to either northern Scotland or Scandinavia. But it was a tremendous sight and totally unforgettable.